Welcome to a special travel episode of Basic Law. I'm Aylana Meisel coming to you from Washington, D.C. And today we're going to talk about the dismissal and resignation of Shin Bet Director Ronen Bar, the role and institution of the Attorney General in this and other affairs, and a new proposal by the government to reform the institution of the Attorney General. So we'll be unpacking all of these vital topics today with returning guest, constitutional law scholar, burgeoning media figure, and all-around excellent human being, Dr. Ben-Shemesh. Welcome.
Thank you. How are you?
I'm great.
Thank you for inviting me. Happy to be here again.
I'm very, very glad to have you back. I think our first conversation was extremely informative. I got a lot of great feedback about it, and I know that you will bring that talent for elucidation yet again today. So there's been a lot of water under the bridge relating to the, I suppose, attempted dismissal of the Shin Bet director, Ronen Bar. And I want to use that as a jumping off point for some of the things that we'll be discussing today. And I know that you followed this situation quite closely and even commented about it a lot to the Israeli media. So could you give us just a nutshell summary of what this entire controversy has been, starting from the point at which the government tried to fire him?
Yes, well, maybe we should start a little bit earlier.
Okay.
Ronen Bar, the head of the Shin Bet, the Israeli security agency, he was not appointed by this government. He was appointed by the previous government that was headed by Naftali Bennett. And in Israel, unlike in the United States, well, in the US, when a new president comes, he has the power, and usually he does just use it to replace all the heads of the security services and agencies, including Donald Trump, who replaced the head of the FBI just a few weeks after he came into power. If I remember correctly, it happened in February or something like that. And also, it is not expected from the head of the Shin Bet to resign when the government that appointed him is replaced. So we have a head of the Shin Bet that is supposed to have a very close relationship with the Prime Minister and a very close relationship with the government. The head of the Shin Bet was not chosen by this government, and he was not chosen by this Prime Minister. According to our laws, the head of the Shin Bet is appointed for a 5-year term. So he started in 2022, and he was supposed to go until 2027. Now, there is another clause in our law, the law of the Shin Bet, that says that the government has the authority and is allowed to terminate his position earlier than 5 years. It doesn't mention and it doesn't enumerate any reasons. The government does not have to give any reasons. It can just decide the government decision to say, okay, we don't want this head of the Shin Bet anymore. We want to have a new one. They can replace him and fire him. It's a government decision. So that's the background. This head of the Shin Bet was not appointed by this government. It was not Netanyahu's pick. Okay? So, nevertheless, Netanyahu didn't fire him in 2023 when he came into office. In it was early 2023 when he came into office, and he stayed in his position. Then came October 7th. I'm not going to go into the details about the role of the head of the Shin Bet in this colossal tragedy of miscalculation and misunderstanding. Why wasn't he able to give us alert during the night of the October 7th when he saw the information coming in? Various kinds of information were getting to his own desk, and he was sitting there during the night between the 6th and the 7th of October, and the night between the 7th and the 8th of October. He was sitting there getting all the information, and he didn't alert anyone. He didn't wake up the army officials, commanders. He didn't call the prime minister. He didn't call the minister of defense. He decided, so I'm not going to go into this, but we have to know that on October 7th, the head of the Shin Bet bears a very large part of the responsibility for the horrific tragedy we experience, for not understanding the science correctly, for not giving people a heads up at the right time, and for not preventing the events that happen. As far as we know, Ronen Bar offered his resignation to the Prime Minister a few days after the event, but the Prime Minister asked him to remain in office. And I think correctly so, because the Prime Minister thought that it was not a good idea after this tragedy to start, firing people in such important positions, and maybe it's better to wait a little bit, stabilize the situation, and see what's going to happen. So he stayed and he remained in office, even though he had this, as I said, large responsibility for the events of October 7th. Then came late 2024, when things between the prime minister and the head of the Shin Bet started to be even more shaky for various reasons. And then in March 2025, a couple months ago, the government decided to fire him. That's the decision is clearly under the power of the government to do. It is the authority of the prime minister and the government to appoint the head of the Shin Bet or replace him whenever they think they want a new head of the Shin Bet.
Has it been done before?
Never. No,
Okay.
never. The Shin Bet, the head of the Shin Bet was never fired, but previous heads resigned after colossal events. For example, like in 1995, when Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated, it was the major failure of the Shin Bet, because the Shin Bet is also responsible for the security of the Prime Minister. They failed, and the head of the Shin Bet resigned shortly after that. So we had heads of Shin Bet leaving their office following major failures. We never had an event in which the head of the Shin Bet was fired, not because we didn't have heads of Shin Bet leaving early, but because they never got the point that the government had to fire them. The prime minister told the head of the Shin Bet, "We don't want you anymore." The head of the Shin Bet used to just simply resign.
I'm gonna just add one small point, because you mentioned it earlier about Bar being a Bennett appointment, and we're gonna get into a little bit later on, I assume, the court saying that the procedure behind the firing of the Shin Bet director is, dubious. But even the hiring, it's not that there's a direct appointment. There's a senior appointments committee for these people, right? For certain senior bureaucrats, in which the capacity of the government to pick them, I believe, is still full if you talk about it legally, but in practice, it's the recommendations of the committee that set it. So I'm mentioning it only because I think that it's a worthy topic that we'll have to go into in another episode. But it's a very big key to understanding how you have so many people at top positions within the government who may even have oppositional views toward the government that seemingly appointed them or that has
Right.
allowed them to continue.
Right. The committee you're talking about, the senior positions, the hiring committee, has a very limited jurisdiction, though. We have to remember that. They only have to make sure that the appointment or the firing of the person is not actually unreasonable and has actually no reason. They do have to just make sure that the most basic standards of review are satisfied. They don't have a real meaningful role in deciding who's going to be hired for a certain position or who's going to be fired from a certain position. We do have it. We do have a committee that has more power in the case of the attorney general, but that's a different committee. To fire the attorney general, you have to go through a committee that has more power than to fire the head of the Shin Bet.
Yes.
The committee that is responsible for the second kind of events, firing the head of the Shin Bet, is almost just a procedural step you have to go through if you adopt the interpretation of the law that the attorney general said. It's not even a clear legal question. If you mentioned it, I will just say it now, and I will go back to the line of presentation. the idea that the firing of the Shin Bet will be the subject of legal proceedings would have been just unheard of when I studied law. So this is important to know. If someone would told me or my constitutional law professor that the government decided to fire the head of the Shin Bet and the head of the Shin Bet is not willing to go home, and instead they file a petition to the Supreme Court to suspend his firing, the answer would have been, well, the court will not discuss it. This is not the kind of questions that the Supreme Court discusses and goes into because these are very sensitive political security issues. This is one of the core elements of government that the prime minister and the government are allowed to decide who is the head of the security services and how long he's going to stay in office and when it is the right time to fire him and replace him with another. So the very fact that Ronen Bar refused to accept the decision of the government and remain in office, and he didn't go to court personally, which is another weird decision on his part, but other organizations, the organizations that usually go to court whenever something that they think is wrong happens, they went to court and the Supreme Court suspended the decision of the government. It was a temporary decision, but it is still in force. The government decided in March to fire Ronen Bar. The date that they decided it was going to be fired was that his position would end would be April 10th. We are now in the middle of May. He's still in office. We now know that he's going to step down finally in mid June, but not because the government decided, not because even the court decided, but because he accepted the or he agreed to step down. So we have this very bizarre situation in which the head of the Israeli security agencies, that is supposed to be completely under the leadership of the government, becoming this independent official, independent person that is deciding when and how, if at all, he's going to go home. So we have to understand how bizarre this situation is. And again, just for comparison, Donald Trump only had to say, I don't want the head of the FBI to continue. And that was the end of it. Nobody would have dreamt in the US to go to the Supreme Court and ask the Supreme Court to stop him from replacing the head of the FBI. And of course, rightly so. If you have the government and the government has to fulfill its obligations toward the state of Israel and its people, then we have to allow the government to at least to appoint the people they want to work with in this very important and sensitive position, such as the head of the Shin Bet or the head of the army or the head of the Mossad. So the fact that the Supreme Court is preventing, and we still don't know on what grounds because we don't have a decision yet,
Right.
it is unprecedented. It never happened before. Never before the Israeli Supreme Court allowed itself, dared, I would say, to step into this sensitive area of the relationship between the government and the prime minister and the head of the Shin Bet.
But
Okay?
you mentioned that this would never happen in the States. And in fact, I believe that the decision of the court even drew comment from Senator Tom Cotton, who tweeted about it. And, I think to the American mind, it's quite simple, right? You need, as you're saying, you need to have full faith in the people that are running your security and law enforcement agencies. And he added the point that if the elected government of Israel does not have that faith, then why should the United States working with Israel now, have
Obviously,
that faith?
of course.
No,
Well,
so
to be fair,
Yes.
just let me mention his Ronen Bar's side of the issue just for a minute.
please.
So in these bizarre legal proceedings, he submitted this affidavit to the Supreme Court, raising all sorts of accusations against the prime minister, which is again another crazy situation, right? The head of the Shin Bet who is supposed to enjoy full faith of the prime minister, is submitting an affidavit to the court telling them that the prime minister is a liar. And his argument was that the prime minister demanded from him to use the capabilities of the Shin Bet for Netanyahu's own personal and political purposes. And what Ronen Bar is doing is defending the independence of the Shin Bet and preventing the government and the prime minister from using the Shin Bet for political purposes. So that's his point, or at least the way he portrays this situation. And I just wanted to, it's not just a whim of Ronen Bar deciding I'm not going to go home. He has some reasons that he gave for his behavior. And again, the reason is Ronen Bar is defending the integrity of the Shin Bet and the independence of the Shin Bet, and and he wants protection from political demands by the government and the prime minister for political use of the Shin Bet. So that's his position. I can comment on that, but I just wanted to say it's not a one-sided story.
No, it's not at all. In fact, first of all, I'm very glad that you mentioned both sides of the story. I think it's incredibly important. People that I know, at least, who have different views on this story, believe that the firing is political, and exactly what you've said about Ronen Bar, that whether it relates to investigations in Qatargate, or if you read the public part of his affidavit, supposedly Netanyahu requested certain things relating to his trials, or to monitor, in fairness, protesters that were stalking political targets. That Ronen Bar felt that these were, if they happened, in fact, that they were improper uses of his office, and he was standing against it. I actually read the public part of the affidavit, and there was a really interesting sentence that stuck out to me, which in Bar's narrative was supposed to indicate a perversion of the rule of law, but it seemed to me that what he wrote was self-evident in most functional countries, which was, he wrote, it was made clear to me that in the event of a constitutional crisis, this is maybe a slight paraphrase, but I think it's the quote, I would be made to obey the prime minister and not the High Court of Justice.
Right. And people used it to say, well, look, a revolution in the Israeli a constitutional revolution again, or I don't even know how to translate. They use the word הפיכה משטרית.
It's not regime overhaul. No.
Regime coup, like illegitimate change of regime, but it is the very basic principle that is written in the Shabak law, in the Shin Bet law in Israel, that says that the head of the Shin Bet and the Shin Bet have to obey the government. Clearly, obviously, they work for the government, the Israeli government. They work for the Israeli prime minister. The Shin Bet is not working for Yitzhak Amit, the president of the Israeli Supreme Court. The Shin Bet is not working for this or that justice of the Supreme Court. The Shin Bet is not an agency of the Israeli Supreme Court. The Shin Bet is an agency of the Israeli government. It is so clear and obvious and elementary that the fact that people are using it to say, oh, look how badly things deteriorated, that the prime minister demanded that the Shin Bet will obey his orders and not the orders of the Supreme Court, just shows you how people just forgot the most basic principles of constitutional law and order in a democracy. That's just pathetic.
So I'm going to shortly move to questions relating specifically to this idea of institutional independence as it expresses itself in Israel in a very different way than it does in other places. But just to wrap up now on the Bar question, I believe that in light of his decision to resign in June, the government has pulled, it's basically asked the court to close the case.
Well, more than that,
but
the government, the government just canceled their decision to fire him.
Yeah.
The government said, okay, the decision we passed in March is no more, does not exist anymore. So now there is no legal basis for the court case because the court case, well, it was against the government's decision to fire Ronen Bar. Now the decision is gone. The Supreme Court case should be closed. There is no and there's no question to discuss. Even so, the head of the Shin Bet and the Attorney General, who's supposed to be a lawyer, she's supposed to know the basic elementary principles that say the Supreme Court does not deal with theoretical questions. The Supreme Court does not hand down advisory opinions about the independence of the Shin Bet as opposed to the government. Or the Supreme Court is not this kind of uh, uh, legal entity that gives you advisory opinions. The Supreme Court only decides live uh, questions that need to be decided. There is no live question that needs to be decided anymore. But we're all waiting to see. Is the Supreme Court going to throw out the case as it should, according to very basic principles of constitutional law that I studied and I still teach? The Supreme Court does not deal with theoretical questions or not, because again, they want to use the Supreme Court again to use the Supreme Court, to use the situation in which we are in, to use the weakness of the government right now to hand down decisions that are unnecessary, only for future precedent that will say two things. One, from now on, the Supreme Court has the power to interfere and decide whether or not the um, firing of the next Shin Bet is legal or not. And two, we, the Supreme Court, are going to set down the principles that the Shin Bet will abide by, not the government, not the Knesset, not the Israeli people. We, two or three justices of the Supreme Court. I'm sure that one of the justices, Noam Sortberg, has no interest in this case. He indicated that in during the oral arguments he tried to convince the parties to somehow agree on a date and just go home. And now we have a date. Noam Stolberg is not interested in this case going any further, I'm sure. But he's one out of three, only three justices in this case. The other two activist justices, Yitzhak Amit and Daphna Barak Erez, are interested to use this situation to grab more power to the Supreme Court at the expense of the sensitive relationships between the Israeli security agencies and the Israeli government. I think this is a dangerous moment. I hope they will not hand down a decision, but I'm not sure about it at all.
Yeah, I I I share your hopes and maybe your pessimism. Let's talk for a moment about the office of the Attorney General, because the Attorney General, not uncharacteristically, is in an oppositional position as far as the government on this case. They want the case to continue for precisely the reason that you've mentioned. So there's now been a proposal advanced to split the institution of the Attorney General. The Attorney General, you will be able to explain far more eloquently than I, but both advises the government and also heads the prosecution, the state prosecution. And so there's an internal conflict within the institution. And the proposal is basically to take those functions and put them in two different places, one of which would be responsible to direct political appointment. Now, before we get to the actual proposal, which I think builds on just decades of scholarship on this, right? I don't know exactly what research was done in the drafting specifically, but this is a very, very old issue that people left, right, and center have talked about for a very long time for a few reasons. I want to just attack this idea of institutional independence because it's cropping up with the Attorney General. It's cropping up with currently the Shin Bet. And we can see both well, we can see in a whole set of recent cases, whether it's the Zvika Klein case, which is where they detained a journalist and searched and seized his phone without a warrant,
The
or whether
editor
there
of
was
the Jerusalem Post.
yeah, exactly.
Mm.
It's yeah, and the scandal that broke about the Jewish department, where they caught on tape the Jewish department in the Shin Bet, which was responsible for researching and for investigating and dealing with the problem of supposed Jewish terror, where the head of the department was caught on tape, basically throwing people into detention with no underlying cause. There doesn't seem to be an effective method of oversight for any of these institutions at the political level. Okay, now that's partially a structural problem. That partially is because the Knesset seemingly hasn't created the right device, I think. And then partially it's because of a cultural conception of institutional independence. And this came up also in the judicial reform, where if you do at this point anything political to change the status of the legal system and the bureaucracy, you are perceived to be affecting institutional independence and attacking the foundations of democracy. Okay, and I'm trying to really grapple with that idea because I think people genuinely believe it. I think the people who believe it genuinely believe it. And I'm not
I
sure
don't
what
think
its
so.
roots are, and I'm not sure how it stops. What do you think?
Oh, I don't think they actually believe it. Nobody
All right,
believes
well,
it.
then there goes
Or
that
they
question.
shouldn't believe it. They're wiser than believing it. Nobody should believe it. Well, let me just go a step back. You're talking about institutions. Of course, we are talking about institutions and the question of the powers of the Attorney General. It sounds like an institutional question, right? It's a question about division of powers, the division of powers within the government. Right. That would have been the right way of discussing it 20 years ago when we were still naive. But I think those people who defend the Attorney General, they don't defend the Attorney General. They don't. They are talking in terms of the rule of law or um, the structure of government, but they are basically defending very specific people. They are defending this Attorney General. They're defending these Supreme Court justices. They are defending this head of the Shin Bet. There's nothing special about Ronen Bar. To be very, very respectful of Ronen Bar is to say there's nothing special about him. I don't want to say he's the worst Shin Bet head we ever had, although it's probably true. But there's nothing special about him. There's no reason not to replace him. There's nothing institutional about defending Ronen Bar. There's nothing special about the Attorney General. She's a reasonable lawyer. Okay. And again, I'm being very moderate here. She is a reasonable lawyer. I have seen better lawyers. There are better lawyers in Israel. You can replace her and get a decent Attorney General. It's not about defending institutions. It's about defending certain people. And the reason people are defending certain people is because of their politics. That's all. That's all. No one in his or her right state of mind would defend on the institutional level the powers of the Attorney General. They are unprecedented. In no democracy, we should accept that one person will be the chief legal advisor of the government, the head of the prosecution of the state, and responsible for representing the government and other state agencies in court. And let me just also add, because people may not know it, that the term the chief legal advisor may suggest that she is advising the government. She's not advising the government. The advice of the Attorney General, so said our Supreme Court, are binding. The advice is binding, and her decisions are binding upon the government. So she's not the chief legal advisor. She's the chief. Professor Shlomo Avineri, the late Professor Shlomo Avineri, who was a Labor Party person. He was the Director General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs during the second Rabin government in 1975, I think. He's not a right wing person. He said the Israeli Attorney General is the most powerful official in the world. We don't have anything like that in any other state. So no one in his right state of mind that looks at it from your perspective, right? From your naive institutional design perspective, no one will accept it. No one will defend it. Of course, we should split the powers of the attorney general. It goes without saying. Professor Hood Gavison suggested it in 1980 something. I don't know even when. 40 years ago, 30 years ago, and committees suggested it time and time again. No one in his right state of mind will oppose it. The only reason people support this attorney general and this head of the Shin Bet, and look who's supporting them. Who is supporting them? Who is supporting Ronen Bar? The opposition. They politicized the Shin Bet. We talked about politicizing the Supreme Court. We talked about politicizing the attorney general. Now they politicize the head of the Shin Bet. This is a tragedy. This is just terrible. People forgot how to think institutionally. If you think institutionally, you know the head of the Shin Bet is responsible only to the government, accountable only to the government, and the government can demand and tell him what to do, and if he's not happy, he should resign. If Ronen Bar truly believes that the Israeli Prime Minister is dangerous in the ways that he is trying to use the capabilities of the Shin Bet, institutionally speaking, he must first resign and then hold a press conference and tell everything that you know and say everything you know. You are not allowed, in terms of just basic security of the state, to stay in your position, in such an important position that the government should have control of, and have this battle against the prime minister during Supreme Court hearings, filing an affidavit, and he's filing his own, and you're a liar, no, you're a liar, and all this under the supervision and approval and apply on Supreme Court justices. Are you all mad? We're not supposed to do that. This is not proper conduct of the state. This is just a circus for political reasons. For political reasons, people support Gali Barav Miara. That's it. They don't support that the attorney general should be so powerful because it is undefendable. There are no good arguments for it.
So when you say that people forgot how to think institutionally, they knew at one point, or is it that the Israeli educational or the Israeli legal and political educational system did not take them there to begin with?
Well, now I'm in the position of the naive person, okay? Because you took it a step further. I said, well, they forgot. You asked me, did they ever know? I believe so. I believe so. Maybe I am naive, but I believe so. I think when I studied law, and there are still lawyers that can think, there are still law professors, and there's still political science professors, and there's still politicians, even politicians, mind you, that can think institutionally and not think only through the very narrow, temporary political interest of here and now. We used to have this kind of thinking. There is an institutional reason for the doctrine that the Supreme Court does not deal with security issues that are as sensitive as this. The institutional reason is to defend the Supreme Court from politicization and to respect the separation of powers. And there is an institutional reason for the doctrine that the Supreme Court should not deal with theoretical questions, because this involves the Supreme Court for no necessary reasons in political questions, again, harming its own integrity, harming its own authority, harming its own status and power. So I am still using those institutional reasons, and you are still using this institutional thinking. I think there is still market for institutional thinking, but we should also be very clear about who is playing this institutional game and who is just trying to fool us. And to say that they're protecting the rule of law, protecting the independence of the attorney general, protecting the independence of the head of the Shin Bet, whatever that means. Why should he be independent? Uh, and the reason, while the truth is that they are basically and only defending two very specific people, because these two people are the long arm of the opposition in the executive, trying to do the work of the opposition, but basically they are obstructing the work of government and preventing the Israeli people from being able to have a functioning government for our own benefit.
As you know, I connect deeply with the answer that you gave. I think the more that I've watched the discourse around, I'll call it broadly reform issues, but basically the entire interaction of the elected part of government with other parts of government, I've realized that none of the sides are really speaking the right language anymore, even the ones that, more accord with my values. And I think one of the most important things that we do at the forum is a student seminar for law students, highly intensive, 2 weeks, 500-600 pages of reading legal and political philosophy, giving them tools to talk again about the separation of powers and judicial restraint, individual liberty, limited government in ways that do speak to the founding ideas in the more successful parts of the West. It's for me a personal passion as well. Okay, I want, though, before we close, and we're going to come to a close soon, to talk about what this proposal is, and in your view, whether it's a good one, in terms of splitting the office. What would that look like, and what problems does it address or not address?
I think the most important part is to have two different people fulfilling two different functions. One is the legal advisor, and the other is the head of the prosecution. The fact that the same person right now is holding these two positions together makes, well, one, I said already, makes her too powerful. And democracies don't like concentration of power in any branch, and not in this particular case also. And it also raises just very specific issues of conflict of interests when the people that are investigated and the people that the prosecution decides to press charges against are politicians. In our case, the prime minister is facing criminal charges. Other ministers are facing threats of criminal investigation, and it's just very bizarre that the person who is the chief prosecutor of the prime minister is also sitting with him during government meetings and giving him legal advice on other government decisions. So this is just even on the personal level, uh, this is not the right way to work. So I think the separation of these two functions is extremely important, and they should do it. Now, of course, the problem is people are saying, "Oh, well, he is only doing it. The prime minister is only doing it so he can appoint his own head of the prosecution, and then the new head of prosecution will close the files that are or terminate the court trials that are underway right now in Israel." So I always and again we have the institutional question clouded by arguments about Netanyahu's own private conflicts of interests. Um, so so theoretically speaking, it the head of the prosecution should not be the same person that is the chief legal advisor to the government. That's pretty clear. How to do it in a way that will not raise the suspicion that Netanyahu is doing it for his own political reasons, I think it's pretty simple to find solutions to that. And I'm sure they will have to do it. Otherwise, the legislation will face problems in the Supreme Court. Um, it is a challenge, right, for the prime minister to be now, or the government to be appointing a new head of the prosecution. One option is the way they did it with they also had a minor change in the Judicial Appointments Committee. They decided to have a change, but the change will go into effect in the next Knesset. So that might be a solution for this problem as well. So we can split the position, but not right now, and not with this attorney general, and not with this government, but maybe in the next government or the next attorney general. So that might be a solution to this kind of problem.
Do you think that it would be possible to I realize that this is what you've mentioned now is perhaps like the key step to disintegrating an overconcentration of power in the institution of the AG. Does it necessarily mean that we will have proper external oversight over the prosecution? We've had so many scandals break in the past year or two about their behavior toward witnesses in the BB cases, some of which even the judges themselves criticized. And the Klein story is another example. But there have been, questions of selected enforcement relating to protesters and so on. Does splitting the institution address that problem as well?
No, we need we must have stronger agencies and stronger bodies and stronger functions, or people that will hold certain functions that will be responsible for judicial oversight, or not again judicial, just oversight of the legal system, of the police, and of the attorney general, and the head of the prosecution, Amit Eisman, because people tried before to form new bodies that will investigate and be responsible for overseeing the conduct of the Justice Department. They failed. They tried to form oversight committees and agencies, and they failed because these institutions, just like the Supreme Court is going to be so strong that the attempt to limit its power failed, because the Supreme Court is powerful enough to basically strike down any attempt to restore the balance. So this is, in Hebrew we say "hagolem kamal yotzro." I don't know how to translate that into English.
The golem has risen against its master.
Exactly. It became so independent that even the Knesset can do nothing to limit the power of the Supreme Court. The same with the Justice Department. They are so powerful that they thwart and they stop. They do not allow us to form effective bodies that will be charged with the responsibility of overseeing the actions of the Justice Department itself. And what you get is, one, a Justice Department is very strong, but strength is not enough, because you do have to have the confidence of the people, right? But they're losing it. They're losing it because of all the reasons you mentioned. People do see all the political bias in all the actions of the Attorney General and of the police and of the Shin Bet. Um, um, but so enough complaining about what they're doing. We need, with the Knesset. The Knesset must form more effective bodies and agencies that will have the power to oversee the actions of the Attorney General itself and the prosecution. Sure, certainly.
Okay.
But it's the responsibility of the Knesset. The Knesset members should do it. Our Knesset members need to be a little more proactive.
Proactive, and I think this is something that we've also talked about. It would be helpful. I'm not going to speak to the content of specific reforms, but clearly some kind of change is needed. It would simply be helpful if those things were framed, I think, differently than they are today. Apologize, I've gone a little bit hoarse. Because it's framed very much as kind of an all or nothing, zero-sum game. One side has to represent democracy, the other not. In fact, all of them are supposed to be doing it together. And to be doing so in the interest of, right, not just the people having power writ large, but the creation of a democratic society in which individual rights are protected and so on and so forth. And that aspect seems to get lost in the messaging, even on the side of I think, very well-intentioned reformers.
Absolutely. People,
Yeah.
I think now the Israeli public is ready to understand and is willing to see the problem. We are talking about the danger to individual freedoms from the government. Fine, this is true. We need judicial review of the government decisions so that our freedoms are protected. But individual freedom can be harmed by lawyers. Individual freedoms can be harmed by the police. It can be harmed by the attorney general, and they can be harmed by the Supreme Court. So if you if you phrase it in terms of how are we going to enlarge our ability to protect the freedom of all the citizens of Israel, this will make it more convincing to people who do not support the government necessarily to support the reforms that are needed within our legal system. So I think this is the way we should go, and this is true. Not only the way we should go, just for reasons that so we can convince people to be on our side, because it's true. That's a true reason.
Amen, amen, amen. So I think we've come to the close of our time. This time, I hope to have you back again. I think you truly explain these things in a way that very few other Hebrew speakers can do in English. And very, very much appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to talk with you, Nana. Thank you so much.